So I wanted to go ahead and kind of go through this, and I was worried as we were starting to get close to time, I didn't want to break it before I had the opportunity to get a little bit more in-depth in the explanation. So we have this aggregate expenditure at some price level, again, a base year price level of 100, and I'm just going to make up some arbitrary Y1 value. Now the question we want to ask is, what happens if price level changes? Luckily, the law of demand already accounts for this. Again, remember, the aggregate expenditure model is a very micro-based model. So the law of demand says that if prices go up, quantity demanded goes down. Well, quantity demanded effectively is what we buy. So we can kind of relate this to say if prices go up, I'm going to buy or spend less. And we can do the same thing we did with our interest rate change in the aggregate expenditure model and our derivation of the IS curve right now. So at a higher CPI value, I didn't give myself a lot of room here, that's okay. At a higher CPI value, we would spend less. So AE to CPI equals 105. We had 5% inflation. And you'll notice that that puts pressure on Y to fall. If I just carry these values down for Y1 and Y2, Y1 and Y2, we can plot out these CPI amounts. So our price level of 100 and a price level of 105 would have to be higher. Again, scale, I'm not scaling it great, but I'm just kind of putting it on there so we can see. So we see at a price level of 100, people were encouraged to buy and spend more. So we have some measure of aggregate demand at Y1, and at a price level of 105, people, well, they spent less, putting downward pressure on GDP. We can combine these 2 points and we get our aggregate demand function. Now again, it's not a shock. We said this is going to follow that law of demand, that I get a downward sloping demand curve. Our aggregate demand function is very similar in behavior to our IS function. Our aggregate demand function is capturing spending. You know, again, just kind of with this twist of the law of demand. So again, we ask ourselves, do all components follow the law of demand? Well, we definitely know that consumers do. Price up, quantity down. Again, the whole first half of 1900 is based on that assumption. And we know that foreign consumers do. We've said numerous times, foreign consumers are the same as domestic consumers. They follow the same rules. So we just have to think about firms and the government. And I actually think that both of those are at least very price sensitive. I mean, the government numerous times, while they spend a lot of money, they talk quite frequently about looking at different price contracts. They have multiple bids. So they do spend and they do strategize based on price. And firms, I think, definitely are going to fall into that. The same thing, that firms are going to take multiple bids and probably go with low price options as opposed to high price options for the same service, which effectively means our aggregate demand curve is somewhat representative of C, I, G, and NX in terms of spending. Now, one thing that's going to be tricky in this model is separating out investment spending from supply side economics. Because if this model is following a traditional supply and demand role, remember, firms are the suppliers. It does create a little bit of a challenge there. So we'll try to kind of point that out. And for the most part, for me at least, I kind of just always default away from trying to ask about investment spending changes, but look for those keywords, spending, and you know it's going to be captured in here for that investment spending amount. Okay, so we've kind of got an aggregate demand built. We need to talk about aggregate supply, and keep this handy because we will kind of come back briefly to this, but very, very briefly, but we will come back to it. So we've kind of got demand built. We need to kind of talk about supply. And whenever we look at aggregate supply, we actually are going to look at two different versions of aggregate supply. We're going to look at a version in the short run, which we very uncreatively call short run aggregate supply, and a version in the long run aggregate supply. Now the reason that we need to look at both of these is because, again, if we're talking on the supply side of the model, we are talking about production. And we have numerous times this semester looked at production in the short run versus production in the long run. In this model, they are different. They are brought about by different features. They are determined by different variables. They're determined by different methods. I want to start with the short run. I could have wrote them both up here. SRAS versus LRAS. Short run versus long run. I want to start with the short run first because, quite frankly, this one's just real easy. In the short run, firms are going to follow that law of supply, that micro definition, law of supply. If price goes up, they would provide more. Effectively, firms are willing to shift their industry to produce more goods at higher prices. Again, we can probably see this with the current coronavirus scare and some of the goods that we're having, we're seeing rapid price jumps. Things like hand sanitizer. Hand sanitizer's gone through some pretty significant price jumps. Well, I bet you there's a lot of people now joining this market if they have some kind of similar production process. I'm seeing ads online of people making their own and selling it. I guarantee you companies are switching their market to make more, they're switching their production to make more things like sanitizer and cleaning products if they can produce something that was close and similar. For example, there's, some of the chemicals that go into hand sanitizer. Maybe some of those chemicals also go into, embalming agents, which I actually think is true, so it's kind of worrisome. There might be companies out there that make embalming agents that say, well, we could switch up and make hand sanitizer now and take advantage of that higher price. And, we have a lot of the inputs already, and we get that short-run law of supply. Again, a very large chunk of your Econ 1900 class was dependent on that. In the short run, we feel that firms will respond that way. They will move their production based on prices. So as the price level rises, so in this case, as the CPI rises, if we want to keep CPI as our variable, more firms join the market and production rises. Overall for a nation. Again, right, like I said, this is incentivizing even people at home to start making and selling their own hand sanitizer. More firms, more production, and the value of that production, if there's more goods out there, GDP is going up. So as CPI rises, more firms join the market, production rises, which causes Y to rise. I'm going to need, I'll erase LRAS, we'll do it way over there somewhere. Again, this is something that's relatively simple to model. When we look at Y versus some CPI, this is going to look very traditional to our supply curve. Have this upward sloping SRAS function. Exactly like what we expected. Okay, so now let's kind of go over here and talk about long run aggregate supply. We actually think firm decision making changes whenever we start looking at long run. And again, we do not have a great time frame for what is short run, what is long run. We don't really know. We don't have a great time frame for that. But we definitely know that if firms are looking in the long run, if they're looking at that, 20, 30 years out, they are not taking price level into account. Quite frankly, we don't know what's going to happen with the price level 10, 20, 30 years from now. I mentioned in our monetary policy section that the Federal Reserve is pretty good within a year. They're real good within a year. They're pretty good within 2 years even. And you get to that 3 to 5 window and they're kind of a maybe. They'll still tell you, yeah, we're doing all right. But even they'll start admitting after 3, 4, 5, 7, 10 years, we don't really know what the inflation is going to be because we don't know what other impact variables are going to be in the economy. So the same thing is going to be true for firms in the long run. They don't know what is going to happen to price 10, 20, and 30 years from now. Thus, they are not making decisions about production based on price 30 years from now. No company out there is going to say, hey, you know what I think we should start doing? Let's start making dry erase markers, because I bet you in like 30 years, they're going to be, $10 a marker. That's just not going to happen. They're not going to alter their production decision for the future guessing at some price. But we do think that firms want to have some idea of production in the future, right? There's, all firms have a plan to be in business for a long period of time. So they have to come up with some way of understanding how future production is going to look. What variables are they going to use? Well, I think one variable they might use is kind of like what resources are available to them. Okay, are we going to have access to these resources for a long period of time? Are we going to be able to utilize these resources for a long period of time? They might also base it on technology. Now again, there's going to be technological change. I understand that. But they might look at, existing technology and say, do we feel this technology will be suitable for a 10, a 20, and a 30-year window? I think that's totally legit. That seems like it would be logical. They might look at things like labor chains. What are the trends in the labor market? And in fact, there's all kinds of other variables that they could look at, and none of them are price of the product in the future. It's just too big of an unknown, which means that a firm is going to create some kind of long run, I'm just going to make the same model here, Y and CPI, some long run production decision, some Q amount, that's what we called it in micro, right? Some Q amount that has a value in production. So this Q amount is some, Y contribution for a firm. And they're going to say, hey, we've picked this Q because we think these resources, this technology, this capital, this labor, whatever, is going to be available to us for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. That seems a lot more logical than trying to decide what's going to happen to price for something in the future. Which means that whatever Q our firm picks, we have a long run aggregate supply that is effectively just a vertical line at that point. We don't know if price is going to be low. This is what we're going to produce based on our inputs, resources, capital, technology, etc. We don't know if price is going to be in the middle. This is what we're going to produce based on our blah, 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 blah. We don't know if prices are going to be high. This is what we're going to produce based on our blah, 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 blah. So we know that firms, when they kind of come up with this, at least for a long run plan, that's kind of where they're looking in mass. Now again, they can alter it in the short run. They can change based on what's happening with price. But whenever they're coming up with a long run strategy, it's based on this kind of effectively, plan for what is our typical unemployment, what is our typical resources, what is our typical capital, etc. This, I'm going to erase, here, this kind of Q, this kind of Y, this now becomes our kind of our Y star. This becomes our long run real GDP in this model. And again, if we start calling them Y1 and stuff like that, I'm okay, but just to kind of keep some of that terminology, that Y star, our long run real GDP in this model. Okay, so why don't we'll pause it there, especially since I'm at the end of the board, and then we'll pick right back up.
I really gotta hold on.